there, right there, next to Dr. Newman.
Very cozy setting.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and welcome to Abu Dhabi. For those of you who are not familiar with Aspen and the types of events Aspen Institute put together, this is only a sampler of what they do. And for those of us who know, have seen the types of work they do, as soon as I became familiar with Aspen, I said this is something that we must do here in Abu Dhabi. I'm glad after all the hard work we managed to pull this together, and thank you all for coming. And with that, I'd like to introduce Walter Isaacson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. It's my great pleasure to be your partner and Waleed's partner in this. I must say of you, Mr. Ambassador, that you're the most respected, the most effective, and the best liked ambassador in Washington. There are many ambassadors in the past 20 years who've been 1 out of 3, either respected, effective, or liked. Some have been 2 out of 3, but you're the only person I know who's been able to be 3 out of 3, and we sure appreciate being your partner, sir. I remember when you called me in, it was in, I think last January or whatever, of 2010, to talk about the possibility of a strategic partnership with the Emirates. And we're really committed to deepening a relationship between the Emirates and Aspen, and someday perhaps even have an Aspen Emirates full-time program here. The type of dialogues that we plan to have between the United States and the UAE, with your help, deal with the notion of innovation, first off, because in some ways that's the driving force that for the past 300 years has distinguished the American economy, and now we have so much to learn from the way Abu Dhabi and Dubai are looking ahead to 2030 and doing so much with the notion of innovation. I was particularly impressed as I was reading and talking to you, but studying it and then reading the plan, how much of it, and I know I've mentioned this to Waleed, deals with inventing the notion of education for the 21st century. Because if you're ever going to have an engine of innovation, it is going to be driven by an entire new elementary and secondary education, but also a higher education that is aligned with the needs of the 21st century and the skills needed in the 21st century. I see President Isaacson here has been doing so much with NYU to do it, but it was such a smart plan to look at specifically what are the needs we're going to have and map those against the type of supply of educated people. And I think we have so much to learn from that in the United States. We're trying to also figure out a 21st century education system in the United States that will create critical thinkers. To me, the notion of critical thinking, dialogue, and tolerance have all formed together to be the foundation for innovation in our economy. Sometimes I fear that we're going to lose that, but I hope this dialogue that unfolds over the next few days will be a driving force in helping us regain some of that, both at in our country, but also in a partnership with the Emirates. I think they're giving, and it wasn't my idea, but I appreciate whosever idea it was, all of our speakers from the Emirates a copy of a biography of Benjamin Franklin I did a few years ago that happens to be published in Arabic. But when I saw the copies of it, it made me think how Benjamin Franklin was the driving force behind a lot of what we're going to do. When he was a young kid and he arrived in Philadelphia, the first thing he did was set up a dialogue group among various people to figure out what type of innovation you could bring to a new city in a new nation. First thing he did was come up with the notion of an academy for the education of youth. But also, they started asking the type of questions that a good dialogue group asks the questions, being 300 years old, is still very relevant. The first one they picked on was, does immigration help or hurt a society like the United States? Unfortunately, they concluded, as they studied it, that immigration was a driving force for innovation. Secondly, they looked at the notion of diversity, of having tolerance for different religions, as you had in Philadelphia, but did not have in Boston, where Franklin had come from. And the notion of tolerance of different religions and open dialogue between different religions, they also decided was a driver of innovation. And I like to think that that scientific thought that they did, because they always asked themselves scientific questions, they were able to tie the science of energy creation, the new electricity experiments that young Franklin was doing with his kite in the rain in Philadelphia, all tied into how they looked into government. But most importantly of all, when I think of Franklin, I think of the fact that starting at age 17 when he came to Philadelphia, up until age 84 when he died there, he donated to the building fund of each and every church that was built in Philadelphia. And at one point, they were building a new hall for preachers who would come through the town. And he wrote the fundraising document. And he said, even if the Mufti of Constantinople were to send somebody here to teach us Islam and preach to us about Muhammad, we should offer a pulpit and listen, for we would learn and we would become a better society. And he was also the largest individual contributor to the Mikveh Israel Synagogue, the first synagogue built there. And so when he died, instead of his minister accompanying his casket to the grave, it was all of the preachers, priests, and the rabbis of Philadelphia marching with him to the grave. That form of tolerance, open discourse, and a willingness to embrace innovation that comes from listening to other people is what the Aspen Institute's about, but it's why the Emirates have been such a driving force in this region and in this world as a society that becomes more and more experimental, open to new ideas, and open to dialogue. So that's why it's such a great pleasure for us at the Aspen Institute, as we did the Ideas Festival with you, the innovation track. You are a great contributor to that. We have a lot of innovation dinners that we do. We hope to do more of these with the Emirates. And I really just hope that this is the beginning of a program that will take us well into the future. Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you, Walter. So as you can tell, I'm a great fan of the Aspen Institute and its annual Ideas Festival. There's something special to the event, whether it's the simple act of breathing the mountain air and looking out of the Rockies, refreshing the spirit, opens the mind, and prompts new ideas. With this first Emirates-Aspen conference, I can promise you all of the above, with the exception, of course, of the mountain air. Here, instead, you'll have to take in the desert breezes and gaze over the shimmering waters of the Gulf. But while the Abu Dhabi scenery may be different, the essence of Aspen will be the same. We expect a lively and intelligent discussion of a critically important subject, innovation. It's a subject particularly relevant to Abu Dhabi because in many ways, we are the world's leading laboratory for creating an innovation nation, as John Kao would say. The United States and the rest of the developed world have spent literally centuries building physical infrastructure, preparing human capital, creating financial and legal systems. What the West has done in generations, we are trying to accomplish in just one. We have truly raced into the first decade of a new century with big plans, and it will be innovation, much more than oil and gas, that provides the real fruit for UAE's successful development. Yes, we're in a hurry, and to understand why, you need to understand a little bit of the UAE's history. And by that, I mean the period before the discovery of oil. The late Sheikh Zayed, the founder of the UAE, once said, "He who does not know his past cannot make the best of his present and future, for it is from the past that we learn." Less than a century ago, the area we now call the UAE did not produce a single barrel of oil and actually relied on imports to meet its modest hydrocarbon needs. The principal source of income was the pearl diving industry. At the time, local divers would collect pearls from the shallow waters of the Gulf. Rare and coveted, the UAE pearls were sold to jewelry manufacturers and then on to buyers in Europe and the US. But in 1916, the bottom fell out of the UAE pearl industry. It wasn't shifting consumer tastes or global economic catastrophe, but rather technological innovation. Someone simply figured out how to make a better and cheaper pearl. And in 1916, half a world away from the UAE, a Japanese entrepreneur patented a new technology for the development of cultured pearls. By 1935, there were over 350 pearl farms in Japan alone, producing 10 million cultured pearls per year at a lower price and with more consistent color and shape than the pearls we were able to produce. Japanese cultured pearls dominated the global market, making the collapse of the UAE pearl industry and the onset of a rapid and painful economic decline that persisted into the 1960s. It was only then that oil changed everything. The poverty of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s is not something most Western audiences often associate with the UAE, but for many of our older generations, the memory is still fresh in their minds. There's a well-known story in the UAE from about the time in 1953 when the late Sheikh Zayed visited Britain and France and was overwhelmed by the quality of their schools and hospitals. Recalling this trip many years later, he said, "I was dreaming about our land catching up with the modern world, but I was not able to do anything because I did not have the wherewithal in my hands to achieve these dreams. I was sure, however, that one day they would become true." Sheikh Zayed was right. And when the UAE was given another chance of prosperity, it grasped it with the knowledge and conviction of a people unwilling to live the past. The UAE leadership wisely decided to use this new opportunity to develop both the country's economy and its social institutions, especially related to education and healthcare. On the economic side, previous generations learned the hard way what a heavy reliance on a single source makes your economy prone to volatile shifts in demand and to unexpected technological developments. I think you might be able to see where I'm going with this. The parallels with the oil industry are simply unavoidable. It's no secret that the oil sector could easily be impacted by sudden shifts in demand, the potential acceleration of climate change, possibly the development of new game-changing technologies. If that happens, we do not want our economy to grind to a halt again. In many ways, the bitter experience of the post-Pearl period has been the real driver behind our efforts to diversify the nation's sources of income away from an over-reliance on oil. During the 1970s and 80s, with the availability of oil revenue, the UAE's drive toward a more diversified economy began with the improvement of our physical infrastructure. We built roads, power plants, seaports, airports, water systems, and telecommunication systems. Today, the UAE boasts one of the most advanced levels of infrastructure development in the world. In the 21st century, the UAE is pursuing an even more aggressive and sophisticated phase of development that relies on diversifying our economy into cutting-edge industries like alternative and nuclear energy, semiconductors, aerospace, petrochemicals, and logistics, among others. Through these complementary diversification strategies, the government of the UAE is seeking to use its resource wealth wisely in order to establish a more sustainable model for the future of our country and our economy. The UAE now is the second largest economy of the Arab world, despite having a population of only 8 million, roughly half the population of Ohio. It's no small thing considering how far we've come in barely 40 years. The UAE pearl industry may be long gone, but our economic future has never been more secure. And in great irony of economic history, we now sell more oil to Japan than any other country in the world. That revenue allows us the luxury to afford a few Japanese pearls and still have something left over to purchase with other goods and services from around the world, including the US. That security, however, has not made us complacent. Rather, it has made us driven. We know how fragile success can be, so we must meet the challenge of sustaining our economic and social development. The answer, of course, is innovation. Our leaders have understood for a long time that this means much more than buildings and infrastructure. Sheikh Zayed's vision of the UAE catching up to modern countries was not only about economic development, it was also about nurturing what he called the real asset of any advanced nation, its people. He and our current leadership knew that this meant investing heavily and innovating in human capital, specifically in education and healthcare. Beginning in the 1970s, along with the roads and power plants, the UAE drastically improved its social infrastructure. We began building schools, universities, hospitals, and clinics. We sent our best students to learn at the world's best universities. We began to reform our elementary and our secondary school system. Today, we continue to strengthen our social infrastructure, often through partnerships with the world's leading institutions, innovators each in their own field. For example, New York University Abu Dhabi welcomed its first class of students last month, with plans to move into a 2,000-student campus in 2012. MIT is working with Abu Dhabi Future Energy Company to create a renewable energy-focused Masdar Institute of Science and Technology. Paris Sorbonne University opened a campus in Abu Dhabi in 2006. The Guggenheim and the Louvre are each building brand new museums on Abu Dhabi's Saadiyat Island. Johns Hopkins Medicine and Cleveland Clinic, which both develop research and educational and public health programs, are already in Abu Dhabi. Thanks to such partnerships and the UAE government's commitment over the years, today we are well along in the first-rate educational, healthcare, and cultural institutions and systems in the world. So in barely one generation, we have come a long, long way. We have put in place key elements of success: physical infrastructure, human capital, financial steadiness, and political stability. But to sustain success, we need constant improvement through continuous innovation. And we know that innovation is hard. If it was only so easy, we could drill for it and pump it out of the ground, I think we would be fine. But unfortunately, we can't. Instead, we have the Emirates-Aspen Institute on Innovation, and in this room, one of the largest reserves of innovation expertise in the world. And the next 2 days, we intend to tap it. Your knowledge is certainly more valuable than oil. But first, let me introduce to you my good friend Waleed al-Mokarrab, who has one of the toughest jobs in Abu Dhabi. Waleed is the guy who has to turn big plans into meaningful progress, and usually profitable. To that, Waleed al-Mokarrab.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you, Walter. I'm not going to take up too much of your time because I know that we all want to dive into the panels, which are, I think, where all the cooking and innovative thinking is going to come up. But I would like to say a couple things about two topics that are really near and dear to my heart. First is, of course, the Abu Dhabi blueprint in terms of where we want to diversify our economy and go forward. And second, of course, is innovation, because that in many ways serves as the engine, serves as the underpinning, the enabler, if you will, to get to where we need to get to. So first, let's start with the blueprint. So not too long ago, I think based on directives of our president, essentially Abu Dhabi created a blueprint for itself. It's not a micro plan. It's not a plan that articulates all the different steps that you need to take to get to a state of economic diversification, but it provided something that was unbelievably important, and that was a unifying theme that would carry us in a particular direction. And that unifying theme essentially came out of the recognition that, look, we're an economy that essentially derives our GDP, our income, mostly from hydrocarbons and oil and gas. And you know what? Over time, we're going to need to change that. We're going to need to change that not because oil is going to run out, though, of course, peak oil theory, all that other interesting stuff, but we believe that we're well positioned going forward. We need to do that because we need to create an engine that will help us diversify our economy, increase innovation, and those two things will in many ways create spillover effects from a social engineering perspective, from an education perspective, that we think are going to help us launch into a state of affairs that I think will help us move away from a 60% contribution of hydrocarbons to our GDP into one where we decrease that by 20% on a relative basis over the next 20 years. So a couple things. Number one, that doesn't mean that we're going to slow down oil and gas production. Doesn't make sense. Why would we? These are some of the comparative advantages that we have that will help us lubricate some of the changes on a go-forward basis. So we actually even have made the job even tougher for ourselves. So let's have oil and gas grow at the rate that it's going to grow. Let's keep investing in that infrastructure. Let's keep using that, forgive me, as a lubricant again. But over time, let's grow the private sector, the non-oil private sector, in such a way as to drive innovation and all the other things that I think all the different panels are going to talk about today. So as we codified this idea, essentially we knew we had three big challenges that we had to deal with. I think number one, know what your advantages and disadvantages are. Yes, we know that we're a large oil producer, but there's got to be other stuff. And there really were a couple that we think helped propel us and put us in an important position going forward. Number one was the quality of our infrastructure. As the ambassador said, he recalled how His Highness Sheikh Zayed invested in both people and hard infrastructure. Both of those things are areas of current and future comparative advantage, if I can use that terminology. We spent a lot of time building our port infrastructure. We spent a lot of time making sure that we have a world-class telecom infrastructure. And there are other bits and pieces that we think will help enable different things. So if you have the capital advantage, money, if you have the transport infrastructure and the other bit, you still have that one piece of the equation that's missing, and that's the people, right? And that was really the second element that we had to leverage, the second element that we really had to spend a lot of time thinking about as we wanted to kind of help move along that journey. So I think through a partnership, again, under the aegis of this vision, once everybody was crystallized by the need to do this, working together hand in hand with the folks at the Mubadala Institute, with His Excellency Dr. Muhairi, who sits on top of the educational infrastructure here in Abu Dhabi, and all the other unbelievably important players. Of course, Dr. Isaacson was already called out earlier today. We've established, we think, a tertiary network that will help enable us to look at those human capital requirements and help transfer and translate those requirements into productive reality from an economic development perspective. So what are the areas that we look at? How are we going to try and match those input-output tables, if you will, to get to where we need to get to? Well, first, let's identify the areas that are important to us. And every single one of the areas that I'm going to mention are really connected by a neat set of themes. And the first and most important theme that we have to kind of recognize is that we needed to look for those areas that had high engineering content, therefore high innovation, because it is precisely those areas that will help generate the positive externalities, that will help flow into our economy-wide development, and obviously do all the things that we wanted to do. So what are some of those areas? Number one, aerospace. Number two, semiconductors. Number three, obviously let's work at the enabler level as well, can't forget that. So heavy infrastructure investments. Okay, you can do that, but you certainly need to have good healthcare and education. So those are two areas that we needed to add there. And others, right? But those are really the big ones. Renewable energies were called out. Nuclear is another big one. Think about the size of our economy. Yes, Abu Dhabi by itself is the second largest economy in the entire Middle East. So is the UAE, right? So Saudi is the first. Now that being said, while we do have tremendous productive capacity, we don't have a lot of absorptive capacity as an economy. So really what that means is, we have a stable population, but at the same time, we can't be good at everything. So picking your battles, picking those areas, has been an unbelievably important thing to do. We know that we're going to fail, hopefully not, but we know that some of them aren't going to be as successful, right? History shows us that picking sectors isn't always the easiest path to successful outcomes. But you know what? One of the things that we're trying to do is spend a lot of time thinking about how we can de-risk those propositions. And some of them are, again, more successful than others. But I think so far, at least in the first 5 years of this unbelievably interesting journey that we're all walking together on, I would say that we've probably had a little bit more success than failure, which is, in my book, is kind of a great place to be. So one of the things that I think helps realize these different things is, okay, so you've got that blueprint there, but now you need to create an engine that will help you get there. And it's not any one entity, institution, or company that's able to do it. It's always a set of intertwined partnerships and networks that kind of bring everybody together to do that. But I do want to single out, one organization that I think is important, and forgive me for being selfish, but it's mine. It's the Mubadala Development Company. It's where I work. It's where I spend almost every waking hour. And the idea there is we wanted to create a catalyst. And this catalyst would live under a particular set of disciplines, right? And it would be those disciplines that would work within a certain interplay that would get us to where we needed to get to. So here's what I mean by that. Number one, a lot of different things, at least on a piece of paper, are great from an innovation perspective, can be considered strategic, are interesting from an economic diversification perspective. But the real kind of thought point, the real conundrum that we had to face was about how do you keep yourself honest in this equation? There are a lot of different things that can be strategic, lots of different things can be innovative, but how do you make sure that you minimize the risk of white elephants? Nobody wants to get into that game, right? So the discipline that we interjected into this equation was about profitability. So we only wanted to do things, and this really made our job that much more difficult, right? So we only wanted to get into those sectors, into those areas, create those businesses, ultimately fuel those clusters that in and of themselves had a positive rate of return. And it's not just positive rate of return, you know, oh, okay, well, we created X number of jobs, all extremely important. Oh, we contribute X amount to the GDP of, you know, Abu Dhabi and the UAE, unbelievably important. But by the way, they have to make positive net income as well. They have to make money. And not only do they have to make money, but they also have to be top quartile in any industry that we choose to compete in. Difficult. It's not the easiest thing in the world. And again, we've had our ups and downs, but I have to say that we've been, as a management team, unbelievably thankful to our board of directors, to our shareholder, to His Highness the Crown Prince, who's our chairman, for giving us that discipline to get to where we needed to get to. So, ladies and gentlemen, don't want to take up any more of your time. We'll move into the panels and I think talk about a lot of these interesting ideas. But I did want to tell you how pleased I was to be asked to speak at this forum today, to welcome everybody. And I can't tell you how humbled I am to be sitting among such an esteemed group of people today. Thank you.
It's my pleasure to introduce Vijay. Most of you know him, Vaitheswaran, who is Global Affairs for The Economist and wrote an amazing book called Zoom, which everybody must read. I hope it too has been translated into Arabic, which is would be good. And is one of the great journalists, but also